Hey guys, and welcome back for another video. Today I'd like to talk to you about crafting, and I'm going to be using weaponsmithing to show how crafting works, but this is not a weaponsmithing specific guide. That being said, more than anything else, this guide will focus on the armor and weapon style of crafts. But regardless of what craft you'd like to train up, if you're new to crafting, which you should be if you're watching this video, there should be something here that'll carry over to any other crafting discipline you should want to learn in the future. Part of why I've chosen to focus this around the armor and weapon style crafts is because a good reason to want to learn crafting is because you want the yield of that discipline. In other words, you might want to craft your own weapons and armor. Outside of that, you should really only be crafting if you're leveling and you want to gain some character levels. In addition to crafting discipline experience, you will also gain character experience, and you can gain quite a few levels from just standing there crafting. Also for this guide, we're going to be using Lion's Arch as the place that we're crafting, but if you don't like Lion's Arch, or if there are simply just too many players for your liking, feel free to craft at any of the racial starting cities, as they have all of this same stuff right there as well. But again, for this guide, head to Lion's Arch, and if you look at your map, you should see a giant star shape, and that is where all of the crafting disciplines will be located. If you walk around the area, you should see a symbol next to each crafting discipline, but if you're new to this, which you probably are, you may not know what each one of those represents. Fear not though, because in that same area, you should see the master crafter for each craft, and just above their nameplate, it'll specify the craft that they are the master of. And being the master crafters that they are also the NPC you'll need to talk to in order to learn a craft. By default, you'll only be able to learn 2 crafting disciplines per character, but there are some gem store items that will increase this number if that's something you're interested in. Also, if you should decide that you want to change a craft, you can do that at any time and switch back to the old one. Keep in mind though that it does cost a bit of gold to switch back to a crafting discipline that you've trained up, but you do have this option available if you should, say, decide later in your game time that you'd rather craft something else. To get started crafting, you're going to need to first learn a crafting discipline, but you'll also need a fair amount of your time, because this isn't going to take all day, but it's not something that you're going to complete very quickly, as well as the materials necessary to complete any of those crafts, or the gold to buy those materials off the trading post. As long as you've been gathering while you've been playing, you probably have a good deal of materials saved up for at least the first couple of crafts. And if you haven't been gathering and you want to get into crafting, I highly recommend that you start, because the more things you gather, the less you have to buy later on. So with that all out of the way, we can now move on to crafting itself. Be sure that you've actually learned the crafting discipline from the master crafter before getting started, and then right next to that NPC, you should see a prompt to press F, opening up the crafting station for whatever discipline that you decided, in our case, weaponsmithing. Taking a quick look at the crafting UI, you should see at the top of the screen there is a search field. If you know exactly what you're looking for, you can type it in there. And just to the right of that search field, you should see a cog that allows you to filter out some of the earlier crafts the further you progress. If you look at the left-hand side of this UI, you should see several tabs. From top to bottom, we have Discovery, Production, Bank, Collectibles, and finally Wardrobe. Now the first 2 we're going to talk about in just a second, but it is worth mentioning that crafting stations actually double as an access to your bank. Moving forward, if you're ever closer to a crafting station than you are a bank, you'll know that you can access the same stuff at half the distance. The wardrobe is a nice addition here because it allows us to look through some of the skins that we have unlocked, and through crafting you will unlock a few skins, though in the beginning they're not going to be as pretty as they will be at the end. So if we click on the second tab down, or the production tab, you can see that on the left hand side we can see everything that we can currently craft. On the right hand side you may see nothing. That is until you select select a craft, then you'll be able to see on that right hand side everything it takes to make that particular craft. Looking through the crafts we can currently make, you may notice that they appear in different colors. Red is an indicator that you cannot make that craft just yet, but you may be able to once you gain a few levels. Gold lets you know that you're going to get the maximum amount of experience for that craft, and these will show up in several other colors, but I'll talk about that in just a minute. In the current crafts I can make for weaponsmithing, you should notice that there are some finished crafts. In other words, there are things like axes, swords, and maces that I can make right now. These are known as recipes, and you should use these as a template if you're ever confused as to what it takes to make a certain item. So if we click on one of these recipes, you should see on the right hand side all that goes into making it, and most crafts actually follow this same formula. Make 2 components and then combine them with some monster parts. While gathering is going to help you get a lot of the core materials necessary to craft, you will also need some drops from monsters in order to complete these crafts. And while we're on this topic, I do want to focus on this aspect of crafting for just a second, and that's because right now you see that it just takes a few monster parts as well as 2 components. After a few levels though, you'll quickly be switching from monster parts to something called an inscription. Now to be fair, this isn't that big of a change. Inscriptions are crafted out of monster parts and a few extra gathered materials, so it's just a slightly more complicated version of just monster parts. But whether you're using an inscription or you're just getting started out and just using some monster parts, this is the part of the craft that determines the stats of the item you're crafting. If we look back at a recipe, you should notice that next to each one of those components, there's a magnifying glass, and if you click the magnifying glass, it'll actually take you further into the craft that you're trying to make. In other words, it's going to again show you all of the required materials necessary in order to make those components. If we look at some of our components, you can see that I need some bronze ingots. Clicking the magnifying glass again, we can see that bronze ingots are made out of lumps of tin and copper ore. Now you may know where to get copper ore, as that can be harvested out in the open world, but lumps of tin might not be so straightforward. If you head back over to the Master Crafter for the discipline you're currently training, you should see that this NPC actually doubles as a vendor. Taking a quick look at what this vendor has to offer, we should see that lump of tin in addition to several other items. So if ever you're in the middle of a craft and you can't quite figure out where to get an item, always be sure to check that NPC. So now that we know where to get most of the items required to make our first couple of crafts, we could look at that left-hand side of the screen and just start crafting willy-nilly until we're max level, right? Well, you could do that, but I think that that's probably not the best use of your time and resources, so let me just run you through how I typically do this. On the left-hand side of the screen, if you scroll down towards the bottom, you should reach the refinement section, and it's here that you'll see things like those bronze ingots we were just talking about, as well as some other items. By looking through our recipes, we know that we do need bronze ingots in order to create the components for any of our crafts, and by looking through the rest of them, we can see that a few of these are going to require some greenwood planks. The reason that I bring this up is because it's always a good idea to make sure that the items you're refining are actually going to be used in future crafts. So once I've honed in on what items I'll be needing for any of the crafts I can currently make, I start refining those materials in mass. As I refine this bronze ore, you should notice one of the greatest things about Guild Wars 2 crafting, and that's as you repeat the same craft, it actually speeds up. At the same time, you may also realize that the bronze ingot is steadily changing color over on that left-hand side. This is to determine how much experience you stand to gain from completing that craft. Eventually, I won't be able to gain experience from crafting bronze ingots, and the only reason to continue making those would be, well, if I need bronze ingots to craft some components. Make sure that refinement no longer grants experience, or that you have enough materials to begin making components, and then go up to the component section on the left-hand side of the screen. And again, using recipes as a template for the item we'd like to make, I tend to craft about 15 or 20 of each given component that I need for any item. That doesn't mean make 15 to 20 of every single component you see here, only make 15 or 20 of each component required per item. As an example, you can see that for a bronze axe, we need a bronze axe blade as well as a small green haft. So I'd be making 15 to 20 of the bronze axe blade and 15 to 20 of the small green haft. From here, I tend to repeat this process for several other weapons. These would be things like maces, daggers, and swords. I choose these weapons because they require less materials than some of the others to make, and thus I can make a lot more of them when we get to our next step. Between refining and crafting components, you should be around rank 25, and it's at this point that you're going to start to learn new crafts. Again, on that left-hand side, we can see all of our crafts, including the new ones that just popped in, and under inscriptions, you should notice that a few new things have appeared. I tend to make these new inscriptions my #1 priority, and I make sure that I craft as many inscriptions as I have components to make a weapon. To use my earlier example, that would be 1 inscription for every 1 bronze axe blade and 1 small green haft that I have. Now, while I did unlock some new inscriptions, if we scroll up, you can see that I didn't actually learn any new recipes for any of the weapons. Fortunately, that's what the Discovery tab, or the first tab on the left-hand side of the crafting UI, is all about. Clicking that tab, you should see on the left-hand side every item in your bank and/or inventory, and on the right-hand side, you should see something that looks a lot like the Mystic Forge. There are 4 blank spots where you can put items, and then just below that, you'll see a craft button that, when you've combined the correct components, will light up blue. Just like before, feel free to go ahead and start combining items to craft whatever it is that you come up with, but if we think back to what it takes to make some of the other recipes that we had back when we first started crafting, we know that it takes 2 components and some monster parts, or an inscription in our case now. So on the left-hand side of the screen, just double-click on each of the components for an axe, as well as any of the new inscriptions that you've created. Right away, that craft button lights up blue, and you should click craft. Doing so will allot you some crafting experience, but you may also notice that you've got a bit of bonus experience on top of that. Since we have the materials on hand to craft even more of this same item, I recommend crafting them all right then and there for that bonus experience. This probably goes without saying, but doing what we just did there is known as discovering an item, and if we go back to the production tab, you can see that a new recipe has been added for the item we just discovered. It's from here that I typically just repeat these steps for all of the items that I intended to craft. Ideally, through this process, we'll make it to at least rank 75, and at rank 75, you may notice that down in the refinement tab, you can actually use some better quality materials. In our case, that means that we can now craft out of iron. Anytime a new tier of material becomes available, I always make this a priority because it's going to give me the most experience. And it's from here, guys, that you can basically just repeat the steps that I've gone over up until now, all the way up to the original max of 400. The next tier of crafting material tends to unlock between 75 and 100 crafting levels. Whenever that new material becomes available, just refine as many of them as you can until either you have enough of that material or you've run out of experience that can be gained for that craft. From there, just begin making components, typically components that don't require as many materials to make. And once you've got some new inscriptions, you should start discovering for that bonus experience. Now, all of this up until now is well and good if you came here for a weaponsmithing guide, but just to clarify, let's talk about how this carries over to the other crafting disciplines. Well, all crafting disciplines have the same UI. Crafting itself tends to break down the same way, meaning that you'll be refining, then crafting components, and eventually discovering new items. And for the most part, all that really changes between these crafts are the items required to make things, the materials. To make this as clear as possible though, I'd like to compare how weaponsmithing, a weapon variety crafting discipline, compares to the other two, huntsman and artificing. Even just looking at the required materials for each one of these crafts as you level up, you can see that for the weapon style crafts, they're all exactly the same. The only thing that's going to change is the output. In other words, as a huntsman, you might be making some bows, and as an artificer, you might make a staff or a scepter. The amount of a particular item may vary from craft to craft, but the items themselves are the same. Not only that, but all of the weapon variety crafting disciplines are going to require inscriptions, and the recipes for those are all identical. So now that we see the similarities between all the weapon crafts, let's compare the weapon crafts to armor crafting. Now armor is a little bit different, but that's mostly that between each of the armor professions, you're going to need different materials. For the light armor profession, or the tailor, you're going to need cloth and leather. For the medium armor profession, or the leather worker, you're going to need leather and cloth. And for the heavy armor profession, you're going to need ore and cloth. So you can see it's not nearly as convenient as all of the weapon crafts, but let's look at what it takes to craft a piece of armor. Looking at armor smithing, you can see that it takes 2 components and some monster parts in order to create. The only difference here is that instead of an inscription like we made before, armor crafts eventually get something called an insignia, and that works just like an inscription in that it determines the stats of the item you're crafting, only it's for armor. And just like our inscriptions, all insignias across all armor-based crafts are going to have the same recipe. So now you should be able to see how all of this comes together to cover the majority of crafting in the end. Now I didn't cover things like jewel crafting, scribing, or cooking, because jewel crafting is something I don't think you should necessarily worry about. This because you can only craft exotic trinkets, and if you've watched some of my other videos, there are far easier ways to get ascended trinkets. Scribing, you actually just make decorations for your guild hall. Again, this is a endgame craft in my opinion. And cooking just didn't really fit the bill as far as how crafting works. Cooking is more of a discovery-based craft, and you're going to be combining ingredients together the same way you would when you're cooking, for the most part. And that, guys, is the basics of how to craft. If I had any additional tips, it would be that later on, as you level up your crafting discipline, you may want some extra recipes, and recipes are learned but can also be acquired as loot, bought off the trade post, or even purchased from, again, the master crafter right next to your crafting station. As you discover new items and craft them in bulk, you will be filling up your inventory pretty quickly, but as long as you make sure that you have a good amount of salvage kits or the copper-fed salvage-o-matic off the gem store, you can easily salvage all of these items to get some of your materials back, as well as some luck if you're still trying to increase your magic find. And lastly, if you just don't think you're up for crafting after this guide or after you try it for yourself, I will once again plug guildwars2crafts.net, where they break down how to do this fast and simple as long as you have the materials or the gold to make it happen. But as always, guys, I hope you found this helpful. I know this one went on a bit longer than a lot of the videos I typically put out, and I apologize for that, but there's just so much to cover when it comes to crafting. Anyway, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.